Welcome back to Trauma, Healing, and Nutrition, a podcast sponsored by Repair. To learn more about Repair, visit us online at repairconnect.org. This is the second part of our two-part feature titled Certified Organic, Separating Fact from Fiction, and I'm Beth Rebay, the podcast host. If you listened to part one, you learned a little bit about what goes into organic certification standards in the United States. And I do recommend listening to the first part first. In the remaining part of this feature and in this episode, I want to talk through some of the facts and fictions regarding certified organic standards. So first, one of the common conceptions people have about organic food is that it is totally clean and pure, and this is a fiction for a number of reasons. First, organic certification processes are only as clean and reliable as the certifying agency, which in this case is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and organic certification standards do allow a limited amount of some contaminants into certified organic food. And in addition, certified organic standards don't regulate everything, right? So certified organic doesn't prevent the introduction of contaminants through the air, through existing municipal water sources, and those that are pre-existing in soil, regardless of the agricultural practices of a particular grower or the in-house practices of a particular food manufacturer. So certified organic food is not totally clean and pure. What is true is that, generally speaking, if organic certification standards have been carefully adhered to, then certified organic food is likely to be less contaminated and contain much fewer synthetic or genetically altered substances than inorganic food does. So, in simple terms, certified organic food is generally cleaner, but that does not mean it's totally clean. Second item, inorganic food production can create additional hazards for farm workers or growers due to chemical exposure. So that is a fact. One of the things that we see is that the agricultural practices involved in growing inorganic foods do involve hazards to people who are involved in the food production. In particular, overexposure to toxins contained in anything from pesticides to insecticides, fungicides, as well as sewage sludge fertilizer. So often we think about organic food consumption or purchases as solely an individual choice, and actually one of the really important reasons to consider supporting organic growers when we can and when it makes sense for us otherwise is that organic food production standards can be substantially less dangerous or hazardous to farm workers who are often racially and economically vulnerable people. So from the perspective of labor justice, racial justice, immigrant rights, there is or can be a natural synchronicity between caring about organic standards from a health and environmental perspective and caring about it in terms of human rights. So again, it is a fact that inorganic food production can be quite hazardous to farm workers and to people involved in food manufacture. Third statement I'd like to examine: non-organic produce is relatively safe if you remove the skin, use a vegetable wash, and it has a thick peel. That's a fiction. I often hear the idea that if a food is contained in a fairly thick peel, like an orange, a banana, or coconut, then it's not really all that important to make sure that it's certified organic. And if you listen to part one of this series, you learned that exposure to things which hit the skin of a food product is only one of the areas in which organic food production involves significant rules. 3 of the others that I covered, meaning food irradiation, genetic modification, and the use of sewage sludge as a fertilizer, none of those are mitigated at all by removing the peel from a food, because those practices aren't just hitting the exterior of the food. It's also important to know that with some pesticides and other chemical sprays or substances that can be treated on the surface of food, the skin of a food is not necessarily adequate insulation. So even just from the perspective of chemical pesticide exposure, having a thick peel or skin may reduce how much of the chemical gets through, but it doesn't totally eliminate it. But again, with something like sewage sludge, where the food is being grown in a fertilizer and that fertilizer is getting into the entire cellular makeup of that food, or with irradiation or genetic modification, which affects every cell of the food in question. Again, the fact that there's a skin or peel or that you wash it well does not mean that your food is clean or as nutritious as you want it to be or relatively safe. So again, non-organic produce is not adequately safe just because you remove its skin or wash it thoroughly or it has a thick peel. 4th item I want to examine. Organic food production standards are silent on labor ethics. So farm workers involved in organic food production may still be exploited or subjected to unsafe labor practices. This is a fact. I think folks sometimes just associate the fact that something is certified organic with the notion that it's generally good. And while I prefer that food be certified organic, from a labor and environmental as well as a health perspective, that does not mean that that organic food growers or manufacturers are respectful of workers or have thoroughly safe workplaces. Organic food standards are only applied to the food production, not to other areas of human rights or social justice. So in knowing whether a food manufacturer or a farmer is representing a set of ethics or practices that you'd want to support, organic food certification is only one consideration. 5th item I'd like to just review. If it's not genetically modified, then that's really the same thing as it being organic. That's a fiction, and it's one that I see people often be confused by. Just because you see a non-GMO label on food does not mean it's certified organic. Remember that genetic modification was one of the 4 requirements for certified organic standards covered in the previous part of this feature. So if it is not genetically modified, it may still have been sprayed with a wide array of toxins, it may still have been irradiated, and it may still have been fertilized with sewage sludge. Non-GMO and organic are not interchangeable. So if it's organic, that means it's non-GMO. But if it only says non-GMO, that does not mean that it's otherwise organic. 6th statement I'd like to review. Organic food standards are not necessarily reliable. Roughly speaking, I would say that's a fact, right? So when folks are saying, can you really trust that organic food standards are what they say they are? While I don't want to be alarmist about it, what I do think is true is that the quality of organic food is only as reliable as the certification process. And what we see is that agricultural lobbyists are often pushing to weaken the document that I mentioned, the national list maintained by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and to allow the use of more toxins in organic food production. So a better way to think about it would be to say that organic food standards are only as reliable as the U.S. Department of Agriculture and our federal government and the USDA are much more likely to be stringent and strict in response to strong public pressure and oversight and monitoring. So organic food standards become more reliable when we are watching the process or supporting the organizations that do so. The seventh item that I'd like to review. We don't really know if inorganic food is less healthy or more carcinogenic than organic food. Roughly speaking, that's a fiction. We actually have a lot of evidence indicating that food prepared with inorganic food standards is, relatively speaking, more likely to be carcinogenic. What is true, and sometimes what I think people are extrapolating from, is that we need a lot more data. We need more studies to be done exploring and investigating the relative health outcomes associated with regular consumption of certified organic versus inorganic food. So we don't have enough information. But we already have quite a bit of data and evidence that indicates that inorganic food production standards are associated with a number of health risks and do contain a higher proportion of carcinogenic substances in general than certified organic food. Again, these are broad generalities. You can find exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, it tends to be true that we have an actually substantial amount of evidence indicating that organic food doesn't contain all of the health risks that inorganic food does. Eighth item I'd like to cover. Organic foods are often more expensive, and that generates barriers to clean food for low-income communities. That's absolutely and indisputably a fact. Organic foods are often, at the market, substantially more expensive than their inorganic or conventional counterparts. And so one of the things that we know is that eating organic in a regular way is often basically a socioeconomic privilege. And that obviously is incredibly problematic, particularly when we think about the ways in which poorer quality of food and traumatic stress can interact in the bodies of vulnerable people, vulnerable and traumatized communities. The ninth item I want to address, I've often had people think that a number of different labels mean the same thing as organic. So if a product is labeled all natural or fresh or healthy, is that the same thing as organic, or does that mean the same thing as organic? And it's a fiction to think that these terms are interchangeable. So all natural does not actually mean free of chemicals or synthetic or human-made content. Fresh does not mean clean. And just because a product says it's healthy does not mean it's actually healthy. One of the reasons why having an actual certification process is significant is because at least it tells consumers that to the extent that we trust the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and granted, given their legitimization of sewage sludge, along with the Environmental Protection Agency, I can understand why there would be some distrust of the USDA, but at least we know that there is an actual outside entity that is essentially doing something to ensure truth in advertising. So again, just because a product says it's natural or it's sold at a health food store or at a farmer's market does not mean it is, by default, actually organic. So I'd like to close this two-part feature with a few items for action. What do you do with all this disturbing information? Besides, keep it in mind when you are obtaining food for yourself. One step is to get familiar with an organization called the Organic Trade Association. And you can find them online at ota.com. This is not necessarily an endorsement of the Organic Trade Association, but it is the largest and most long-standing organization for organic growers in the United States. And so knowing what they are doing, what information they're sharing, is really a useful way to begin to get familiar with the organic foods movement. A second area for action is to think about not just shopping organic as an individual, but figuring out how to share organics with the people in our communities. One of the reasons that, again, organic foods are overpriced is that a relatively small portion of the food in the United States is certified organic.